Welcome back to the Explainer. We're jumping right into ASC 34040 contract costs, specifically Section 2 of 6, key terms and costs to obtain a contract. Now, in our first section, we laid down the groundwork, right? We mapped out the overarching scope and exactly why these standards exist in the first place. Well, today, we're taking that broad foundation and zooming in. We're going to bridge directly into the precise vocabulary you need to confidently execute this standard. It's all about giving you the exact tools to make accurate accounting judgments without the headache. So let's get right to it. Here is our roadmap for today. We've got 5 quick stops. 1. Essential vocabulary. 2. Asset versus contract asset. 3. The incremental test. 4. Testing for recoverability. And 5. Key takeaways. All right, Section 1, Essential vocabulary. Look, to avoid the absolute chaos of misclassified balance sheets, we first have to build a shared foundation of exactly what these technical terms mean. Accounting is basically a language, and if we aren't speaking the exact same dialect here, things are going to get very confusing very quickly. Let's start with our core concept, costs to obtain a contract. By definition, these are strictly incremental. What does that actually mean for you? It means that if you incur a cost, regardless of the outcome of your sales pitch, say paying for a flight to go meet a prospect or spending money putting a bid together, it must be expensed immediately. You only capitalize a cost if it exists purely as a result of actually obtaining that signed contract. To put a finer point on it, an incremental cost literally only exists because you won the deal. A perfect everyday example of this is a success-based commission. If your sales rep only gets their 5% bonus when the ink actually dries on the contract, well, that's an incremental cost. If the client walks away, the rep gets nothing, and the company incurs no cost. That direct cause and effect relationship, that's the hallmark of an incremental cost. Now, what's really interesting here is the contrast. While today we're laser focused on costs to obtain a contract, you also have costs to fulfill a contract. And these are entirely about performance. It's the money you spend to actually deliver the goods or services you promised. These fulfillment costs have their own distinct 3-part test to qualify for capitalization, which we're going to completely unpack in a later explainer. But for right now, just keep in mind that obtaining a contract and fulfilling a contract are treated very differently. So let's look at the life cycle. Once an obtaining cost passes the test and gets capitalized, it becomes an asset on your balance sheet, either current or non-current. From there, it doesn't just sit there forever, right? It's systematically amortized or expensed over its benefit period. And notice something important here. The benefit period isn't always just the initial contract term. It can actually include expected renewals if the asset relates to goods or services transferred during those renewals. And finally, you have to watch out for impairment. If the remaining expected consideration from the customer drops below your carrying amount, you're going to have to write down that asset. But the standard does throw us a bone here with a really helpful shortcut. It's called the practical expedient for short-term contracts. If you calculate your benefit period and it turns out to be exactly 1 year or less, you don't have to go through all the hassle of capitalizing and amortizing. This practical expedient allows you to just expense those incremental costs immediately. The only catch, if you elect to use the shortcut, you absolutely must apply it consistently to all similar contracts. Moving right along to Section 2, Asset versus Contract Asset. This is a critical safety check. Mixing these next 2 terms up is pretty much a direct path to misstated financials and audit failures. They sound incredibly similar, but they represent entirely different economic realities. When we compare these concepts, it is absolutely vital to separate ASC 340-40 from ASC 606. The ASC 340-40 asset, the capitalized contract cost asset, is essentially a prepaid cost. It's cash you have already paid out to win the deal, like that sales commission, which you are now recognizing over time. On the flip side, the ASC 606 contract asset is a right to future revenue. It means you've already performed the work for the client, but your right to bill them is conditional on something other than just the passage of time. So one is money you spent to get the work, and the other is money you've earned from doing the work. Totally different, and they must be disclosed separately. All right, Section 3, the incremental test. Now that our vocabulary is locked in, let's introduce our primary filter for deciding if a cost to obtain a contract can actually be capitalized. This is really where the rubber meets the road. You need to ask yourself this exact core judgment question every single time you evaluate a cost. Would this cost have been incurred even if the contract had not been won? It is a simple yes or no. If the answer is yes, you expense it immediately. If the answer is no, meaning the cost purely exists because of the win, well, it's incremental, and you capitalize it. Let's actually translate that golden rule into practice. Think about a salesperson's fixed base salary. Does the company pay that whether they win or lose the deal? Yes, for sure. Therefore, it's not incremental, so we expense it. The same exact logic goes for legal negotiation fees. You have to pay your lawyers to negotiate the contract, even if the deal suddenly falls through at the final hour. Expense it. On the other hand, what about a success-based referral fee paid to a third party upon signing? That only happens if you win. Therefore, it's incremental, and you capitalize it. Now, I really want to hammer this point home, especially when it comes to bid costs. Say your team grinds out 100 hours drafting an incredibly detailed RFP response. Those hours and the associated costs are expensed, period. A super common trap is thinking, well, we won the deal, so the RFP cost was part of winning, therefore we can capitalize it. That is completely incorrect under the standard. You would have spent that time and money even if the client had said no. Therefore, it completely fails the incremental test. Which brings us to Section 4, testing for recoverability. Look, passing that first incremental filter is awesome. You've identified a cost that only exists because of the win. But we aren't done yet. We have a secondary check to perform before anything actually hits the balance sheets. A cost to obtain a contract is capitalized only if it satisfies both of these sequential steps. Step 1, ensure it's incremental. We just mastered that. Step 2, ensure the entity actually expects to recover the cost. You can't just blindly capitalize every incremental cost. It has to make real economic sense. And we have this recoverability rule for a very simple, logical reason. The expected margin on the contract absolutely must be sufficient to cover the cost you are capitalizing. Think about it. If a contract is heavily discounted and is already a loss maker before you even pay out the sales commission, you shouldn't defer that commission as an asset onto the balance sheet. Why create an asset today just to be forced to write it down as an impairment tomorrow? If you aren't going to recover the cost through the contract's margin, you just expense it immediately. Now, I know what you're probably thinking right now. Do I really have to test the margin on every single tiny contract? And yeah, that sounds like an operational nightmare. In the real world, you'll likely test this at a portfolio level, grouping similar contracts together. Or you might just rely on your company's overall pricing controls as evidence that recovery is expected across the board. The standard totally allows for this practicality. But, and this is a big but, whatever method you use, you absolutely must document your conclusion and your supporting logic in your working papers for the auditors. Finally, Section 5, key takeaways. We've covered a ton of crucial ground today, from essential vocabulary all the way to the nuances of capitalization filters. Let's wrap this explainer up by cementing exactly what you can now actively apply on the job. To sum it all up, use precise vocabulary to avoid those massive balance sheet errors. Remember that an ASC 34040 prepaid cost is fundamentally different from an ASC 606 right to revenue. Make sure you rigorously apply the incremental test, asking if the cost would exist without the win, so you can properly separate capitalizable success fees from expensed bid costs. And lastly, ensure recoverability so you aren't just deferring a loss-making asset. So here is a question to leave you with. When applying the incremental test today, are you confident your capitalized costs are truly recoverable, or are you just deferring a loss? Keep that thought front and center as you review your ledgers this week. Challenge your own assumptions. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I'll see you in Section 3, where we'll tackle the practical expedient in more detail and dive right into the specific rules for cost to fulfill a contract. Until then, happy analyzing.